Thank you, guys. Yeah, I can't see anything at all. So, my name's Barry. I'm one of the co-founders of Skip. We work on infrastructure for sovereign chains. And today I'm going to be talking about scaling ownership, and hopefully what that means becomes a little bit more clear as I go. I mistimed this talk, so I'm going to have to kind of sprint through it and wave me down if I start going for too long. But I think the first most important background point is that I think of protocols like nations. I think of the work that we're trying to do as much more similar to the work that governments and nation states are trying to do than the work that a company is trying to do. Building an economy, building an ecosystem on top of that economy of people who are using some protocols, currency or currencies as money, and trying to export those currencies elsewhere and becoming self-sustaining. This looks a lot more like what a country might do than what a company might do. And I'm going to come back to this Catan analogy in a bunch of different ways. And like in Catan, most protocols start out as sort of like colonies, right? They're very small, they're non-existent. Maybe they have a city that is located near some resources, but like countries and like teams in Catan, they need to bootstrap a lot of different fundamental resources to survive. Just to kind of cover what I think those are, obviously we have users in liquidity, the kind of like fundamental lifeblood, especially for any kind of DeFi project. We have developers and applications for, everyone in crypto is either building an ecosystem or they live long enough to see themselves begin to build an ecosystem. And then, of course, we have security and network operators, the folks who actually run the protocol, who we penalize if they don't run it correctly or reward if they do. And then there's kind of like the BFT components of consensus and sequencing and DA, and these are the things that the modular movement is really focused on trying to scale. And then, of course, there is narrative, right? I think probably everyone in this room is very frustrated by this fact, but you need to have some marketing presence. If you can have all of these other resources, but if CT doesn't think your thing is big and new and different, then your protocol might struggle to survive. And my basic belief is that for the most part, these resources can be borrowed or owned, right? In the context of Catan, I can either take a risk and roll the dice to try to get some bricks so I can build some roads, or I can talk to MJ and say, hey man, like you can give me 1 brick now and I'll give you 2 back in the future. And protocols are complicated, and these resources that we're talking about that I view as kind of like the fundamental things that make up a protocol are nebulous, but borrowing is a super familiar concept. We know what it looks like. It means we have higher upfront costs. It means lower upfront costs, higher long-term costs, and it comes with these stipulations, right? When you borrow a resource, there are things you can and can't do with that resource, and it also comes with some risk of repossession, that if you misuse the resource or if some event happens in the outside world that's beyond your control, then it might be repossessed. When you actually own something, when you have ownership-style property rights, that can't happen and that doesn't happen. And a lot of what this talk is about is that I am increasingly worried that our protocols are getting addicted to borrowing, and the teams that are building them and the investors that are financing them are getting addicted to borrowing. We can maybe disagree with this, but I'm just going to kind of give some examples that hopefully demonstrate it. I mean, I guess as background, everybody knows people in crypto borrow narrative, so I'm not going to cover that one at all. Most things are recycled and reused when it comes to marketing, but I think we're doing the same thing for some of these other fundamental resources as well. So most protocols borrow users in liquidity. Like a classic and extremely common example of this is these sort of pre-token points farm things that have become very standard among crypto protocols now. They're borrowing users from their future. These are, we all know projects that have huge amounts of TVL or huge amounts of user numbers and some on testnet that if you look one layer deeper, sometimes you don't even have to. It becomes clear that these people are not using the protocol for the benefit of the protocol. They're using it for the potential of some future airdrop or some potential set of future airdrops or something like this. So are these sticky users? Obviously probably not. Maybe one step past that, you have protocols that are implemented as smart contracts on these kinds of fairly centralized L2s right now, where in theory the L2s aren't going to censor the transactions, and then you're just kind of getting the benefit of the distribution of the L2. But in practice, it's a little unclear whether that actually happens or not. For anyone who thinks that you won't be censored by an L2, take $5 million and deposit it into the #1 DeFi protocol on each of the major L2s, and then try to withdraw all of that in a single transaction and see which of those transactions get stuck in the mempool. You might actually be very surprised. One step past that, we've got these kind of like native yield ETH L2s, where users are, your protocol is the L2 and users are really depositing capital into it, but they're depositing ETH, and then you're kind of rehypothecating that into some form of liquid staking token or restaking token and generating yield that way. And I'd argue that these users do not belong to your protocol. They mostly belong to Ethereum in that case. And then on the far end of the ownership spectrum, you've got these sovereign chains that have their own native gas tokens that you cannot use if you are not custodying funds on their chain, and you cannot access if you are not holding their gas token. That liquidity really kind of belongs to that protocol and to that community in some sense. Borrowing security is becoming very trendy now as well. As most people in this room probably know, you have on the far end of the borrowing spectrum these kinds of restaked AVSs from Eigenlayer and Babylon and others that are increasingly emerging. And these things disintermediate protocols from their actual operators. They're disintermediated from the source of the security by an LRT and by another protocol, and the protocol itself doesn't get to participate in these kinds of decisions, and we'll talk more about the trade-offs here later. But one step past that, maybe we have Cosmos Hub style replicated security, right? You've got, in this case, the Cosmos Hub and the Cosmos Hub token holders deciding who the operators of the protocol are, and if they maybe decide, hey, you're not paying a high enough tax to them over time, they'll just turn off your chain. One step past that, you've got this idea of kind of mesh secured chains that's coming out of Cosmos, where you have a chain that has its own native security token, and then it can also be secured by the native tokens of other chains up to some limit. And then finally, again, we have this sovereign proof of stake chain on the far end with its own native token, fully secured by its own native token. And, I think it's very unsurprising that we see this kind of obsession with borrowing and rehypothecation in crypto. It really does align with a lot of our personal incentives as core contributors to these protocols or as investors in them. We're incentivized by various forms of direct and indirect token unlocks to play short-term games, even though we like to think of ourselves as an industry as playing long-term games. And it is not surprising then if your zone of concern is 2 to 4 years that you end up with the kind of profligate spending that we see from elected officials, and not the kind of spending that you might have if our protocols were governed by decentralized philosopher kings. I think the second reason that we are so focused on these forms of borrowing is that ownership as a fundamental property right is an incredibly hard thing to scale. It is, either MJ can own a sheep or I can own that sheep, but we both can't own the sheep. In order for that to happen, we need to actually make more sheep, and that takes time and that takes energy, and that's really hard. Ownership is rivalrous and it's more expensive in this way, but I think it's extremely important for a bunch of different reasons. The first one is that it's really unclear what the long-term costs of all this borrowing is going to be for our protocols and the protocols we build on top of them. I have this example of the national debt clock. There's a bunch of them online if you look. I was trying to find one that was the biggest and had one number. And I think of this a lot in the same way, where right now the US is, in theory, it's fine. We're borrowing all this money from foreign creditors and our economy keeps chugging along and things are going well, but should that slow down or should those creditors become impatient, then we have a real risk of kind of death spiral. And we have some sense of what that looks like with a country when they're borrowing money. We have much less sense of what that looks like with a protocol when it's borrowing users and it's borrowing security and it's borrowing all of these other things. So I do think we need much more thoughtful economic analysis of these kinds of trade-offs. I am not an economist, and I don't pretend to be. I do lowercase r research, as John said, but there are a lot of legitimate trade-offs here that I don't see a lot of conversation around. There's this narrative, for example, with security that when we borrow our security, we'll be able to have a lower inflation rate because the opportunity cost of that capital is lower and it's being rehypothecated into all these different protocols. In practice, we don't know what the market clearing rate looks like yet. When you have 10,000 AVSs and they're all printing some shitcoin, like what is the right amount of shitcoin that you need to print in order to get your AVS selected by the LRTs? I mean, we don't know. Maybe it's lower than what a chain needs to print if it has its own token. Maybe it's not. And it certainly leads to higher proportional sale pressure. I mean, there's a tweet that I did not want to embarrass the person who tweeted it, but of people kind of asking like, hey, has anyone yet built the protocol where I can auto dump all of my tokens that are being minted and rewarded to me through my LRTs or through my restaked capital? And like, that is what our protocols are signing up for, is mercenary capital that is not invested in their mission, is not invested in their country. And then, of course, you have this disintermediation from operators, which for anyone who is involved in an L1 or an L2 or any kind of ecosystem in crypto knows that validators do a tremendous amount of work beyond just validating. They build public goods, they evangelize your protocol's mission. They do a great deal of good that is not really captured in the protocol, and I think disintermediating them will also have consequences. And then, of course, there's this aspect of durability, right? If a protocol pushes an update that its restaking providers view as somewhat risky, perhaps that capital dries up and goes elsewhere overnight. You have a foundation that looks a lot more like quicksand in that way. But it is easier to bootstrap. It is definitely easier to bootstrap. And these are the kinds of trade-offs that we see with ownership and with borrowing across the board. This is just sort of one example. The second reason that I think a lot about this is that it is important to remember that protocolized middlemen are still middlemen, and that the project of crypto is not to eliminate all middlemen. That's impossible. Middlemen provide valuable services many times, but we do want to avoid the same things that have happened in the traditional internet and traditional technology, where some of these middlemen move past the point of value creation and move into the territory of value extraction and rent-seeking behavior. And so it's important that we make sure that we're kind of always making these sorts of middlemen, even as we create them and we get the efficiencies that they provide, optional. And that optionality can keep that rent-seeking behavior in check at scale. As an example of this, from Skip's own work, very quickly, traditional Oracle networks are these kinds of decentralized middlemen, right? You have validators who are third-party, who have third-party security that are creating prices, signing them, and then you have relayers that are sending them to the DeFi protocols where they're used. But that's not strictly necessary. We can actually integrate the process of generating these prices and making them available into consensus, and we can ensure that the chain can generate its own prices. We can make guarantees that these prices actually get into every block as a result. So not only do we not have third-party dependencies for liveness or security, but we also actually have better performance and can have tighter spreads when we have this stronger form of ownership of the Oracle. And this is the most important reason that I think we should be cognizant of all this borrowing. If we're trying to build countries, it's very clear that you can't build an empire on rehypothecated sheep. There's a reason that all throughout history, all of the colonial powers worked really hard to ensure that their colonies were in debt to them, and that reason is that debt is a form of exploitive power. If MJ lends me these sheep when he's got all these sheep, and I take them, and he's like, oh, well, Barry doesn't have a very big colony right now. I'm not super worried about it. He's going to give me back 2 times as many sheep in the future. Everything's going to be fine. And then I start to grow, and I start to build cities, and I start to get real distribution for my form of of money, MJ might start to feel kind of threatened by that. And he might say, you know what, actually, fuck this. Like, I'm taking my sheep back. Like, you can't have them. And then I'm out, shit out of luck. So I think it's important to remember this. And it's important to remember that our goal here is to not lose crypto's ability to continue to mint new kinds of empires and new kinds of countries rather than just kind of reinforcing the existing ones. So that's why it's super important that I think we make ownership itself more scalable. There's a lot of technologies that have been built that do this exceptionally well. I'm not going to get into all of these right now. I'm going to talk about just a couple of things that I think we can do to continue to push the envelope here, and just sort of run through them quickly. The first one is that we can, if we are a little bit more creative about the realities of how our protocols are run, we can make ownership itself a little bit less rivalrous. So there's two very simple insights here. One is that most blockchains have overlapping needs at the app layer. They need bridges, or they need oracles, or they need these other kinds of things that are pretty fundamental for building these kinds of protocols. And the second thing is that they often have overlapping operators. There are very few teams that are exploring what can be built with these realities right now. The Anoma team, I think, is the only one that I've seen do really advanced work on this with their Chimera chains and heterogeneous Paxos, which is basically a form of consensus that can safely facilitate atomic cross-chain composability when you have a quorum of overlapping validators, 2/3 plus 1. But there's other creative ways that we can kind of exploit these facts to find more efficient forms of ownership. Going back to this Oracle example, we can do the same thing at the app layer that we've started to do at the consensus and the DA layer of unbundling the different responsibilities of the chain and then rebundling them in different and more efficient ways. So, for example, DYDX and Osmosis, they both want to have these native enshrined oracles that can be fully owned and secured by their own protocols, but they also have a lot of overlapping validators. And that oracle process itself can be reused across those shared validators. We can reduce the aggregate amount of work that needs to get done and without giving up the control that either chain has over that sort of process. We can take this a step further too. We can come up with legitimately positive sum forms of security sharing rather than strictly adding new slashing conditions that add new risk. We can notice that, hey, you know, if Osmosis and DYDX are both relying on some inclusion guarantees around the USDT ETH price, perhaps if a shared operator fails to post that on one chain, they should be slashed on another chain. And we can actually aggregate security in this way that doesn't change the risk profile too much because the job to be done is the same and the person doing the job is the same. And we can have these kinds of mesh applications in this way. This is stuff that we're not yet working on. I just think it's really interesting. There's a bunch more stuff that we are even farther from working on that I just want to call out. The first one is that the kind of state of open source consensus and kind of network gossip is quite poor. Most sovereign chains run on Tendermint, and most people who are kind of trying to build their new versions of sovereign ecosystems are having to roll their own consensus things entirely from scratch because Tendermint is very old and not performant anymore. And there's a lot of innovations that have been made in consensus research, but most of those have not actually made their way into any single coherent unified open source project that has good distribution. Tendermint is from 2014. I actually learned that while I was reading this, or preparing for this talk. I was a junior in high school in 2014. just to kind of put this in perspective, I know I have matured a great deal since then, and consensus research is maturing at a, I'm sure, faster rate than I am. So this is a huge, huge opportunity. The second thing, I think this idea of chain abstraction, I don't love that term, but this idea of chain abstraction is really important for kind of enabling commerce and trade at scale across these heterogeneous trust zones and heterogeneous VMs. There's a few specific parts of it that I think are really cool in particular and really important in particular. I'm kind of running out of time, so I can't get into all of them, but I think the sort of three principles that I think about is that we need routing and infrastructure that can help people move between any of these different zones very easily. We need messaging layers that allow those people to do kind of take meaningful action and have expressive commerce. And then ideally we can improve our signing infrastructure to a point where we don't have to worry about, okay, what wallet works for what chain. We can just use them all. Huge set of challenging problems here. There's a bunch of teams that are working on this. Just to call out a few of them, Near, Capsule, Hyperlane, Across, I think are doing great work. And then obviously IBC is many teams trying to do great work together. And then I think there's a bunch of different ways that the recent advancements in ZK are going to help us make ownership more efficient. I'm not a ZK researcher, and I do not pretend to be. There are people who are far more brilliant than I am working on these things. But the way I think about it at a high level is that as we make these kinds of, as we make verification more efficient, we can reduce our need for redundant work, and that's going to allow us to, with the same set of operators we have today, scale to a much greater set of kind of sovereign protocols. So I guess the last thought to leave you guys with, since I am out of time here, is that this Catan metaphor is actually a really shitty one. Crypto is not like Catan at all. Catan is a zero-sum game. There is one winner, and we are dividing up a limited board that has a limited set of resources. I think it's really important that as an industry, we remember that that is not the case for us. We're engaged in a project of trying to restructure governments and restructure commerce and restructure economies, and like the board is much bigger. And it's just really hard to go out and find those resources and to remember that we need to build the technologies that can help us pull them in and own them in decentralized ways. And that's why I think scaling ownership is so important. It's kind of refocusing on these boards. So thank you.